The sound that woke me wasn't the usual morning symphony of car engines and hurried footsteps. It was the sharp scrape of metal against concrete, getting closer. My eyes snapped open to see the business end of a mop bucket headed straight for my face. "Move! You smell like piss!" The dirty water hit me like a slap from reality herself. Cold, grimy, and carrying the stench of 1,000 floors that had been cleaned with more hate than soap. It soaked through my only blanket, the blue one with tiny flowers that Mum had knitted during her chemo treatments, back when we still believed the doctors when they said, "We caught it early." I jerked upright, gasping, as the water ran down, my face and into my beard. The cardboard beneath me turned to mush. My few possessions scattered like roaches when the lights come on. "This ain't a damn hotel, you piece of garbage." Roberto Martinez stood over me, his thick hands gripping that mop like a weapon. His gold teeth caught the early morning sun streaming down 5th Street, and his face was twisted with the kind of disgust usually reserved for stepping in dogshit. The name Roberto Manager was embroidered in red thread across his polo shirt, like a badge of authority he wore with pride. Behind him, the morning commuters had stopped their rush to somewhere important. They formed a loose circle, phones already out, recording my humiliation for whatever social media platform would give them the most likes for witnessing someone else's rock bottom. "Get up!" Martinez barked, nudging my leg with his foot. Not a kick, exactly, but close enough. "You're scaring away my customers." I looked up at him through the water still dripping from my hair. 3 months I'd been sleeping in this doorway. 3 months of being invisible until now, when apparently I'd become inconvenient enough to warrant this public execution. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice coming out like sandpaper on wood. "I didn't mean to. Sorry, don't pay my rent." He wrung out the mop directly over my head, sending another cascade of dirty water down my back. "And it sure as hell don't make up for the customers who walk past my store because there's a bum camped out front." A woman in a sharp business suit laughed, actually laughed, while holding her phone steady to capture every second. "Oh my God, this is perfect," she said to her friend. "Sarah's gonna die when she sees this." A teenager with a half-eaten breakfast, burrito in his hand, shook his head and grinned. "Dude's getting the full car wash treatment," he called out to his buddy. They both cracked up like they were watching the funniest movie ever made. I started gathering my things with shaking hands. The photograph. I needed to find the photograph. My fingers scrambled through the soaked cardboard and wet clothing until I felt the familiar crinkle of plastic wrap. Still there, still safe. "Look at him scramble," someone said from the growing crowd. "Like a wet rat," another voice added. Martinez wasn't done with his show. He planted himself between me and the street, making sure everyone could see him assert his dominance over the lowest man in the food chain. "You see this?" he announced, to his audience, gesturing at me like a circus ringmaster presenting the freak show. "This is what happens when you don't take responsibility for your life. When you make excuses instead of making something of yourself." The crowd murmured their agreement. Easy wisdom dispensed over someone else's misery. "Some people," Martinez continued, warming to his theme, "choose to be victims. They choose to live like animals instead of working hard like the rest of us." I finished stuffing my wet clothes into my backpack and stood up slowly. Water dripped from my pants, forming a puddle at my feet. The smell of urine and unwashed body and desperation hung around me like a cloud. "Please," I said, looking Martinez in the eye. "I'll move. I just need a minute to—" "You need to get a job is what you need," he cut me off. "You need to stop being a parasite and contribute something to society." More nods from the crowd. More phones recording. Someone had started a live stream. I could tell by the way they were talking to their screen, describing the scene for viewers who couldn't be there in person to witness my destruction. "Easy for you to say," I mumbled, slinging my backpack over my shoulder. "What did you say?" Martinez stepped closer, his chest puffed out like a rooster ready to fight. I should have kept walking. Should have tucked my tail between my legs and slunk away like the beaten dog they all saw me as. but something in his tone, something in the way he was performing my humiliation for his audience, lit a tiny flame in the cold ashes of my pride. "I said it's easy for you to say," I repeated louder this time. "Easy to talk about hard work when you're not the one sleeping on concrete." The crowd went, "Oh," like we were in middle school and someone had just talked back to the teacher. Martinez's face went red. "You think I didn't work for what I've got? You think this store just fell out of the sky into my lap?" "I think you don't know anything about my story," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "You don't know how I got here or who I used to be." "I know exactly who you are," Martinez shot back. "You're a drunk, a drug addict, or both. You're someone who gave up instead of fighting. You're someone who decided it was easier to beg than to work." He was right about the drinking, had been right about it for a long time, but hearing it said out loud in front of all these strangers, with such certainty and contempt, felt like being skinned alive. "You're someone," he continued, really getting into it now, "who thinks the world owes him something. Well, guess what, buddy? The world don't owe you shit. You want respect? Earn it. You want a roof over your head? Work for it. You want people to treat you like a human being? Start acting like one." The crowd was eating it up. I could see it, in their faces. The satisfaction of watching someone even lower than them get what they deserved. The comfort of believing that poverty was a choice, that homelessness was a character flaw, that anyone sleeping in doorways had simply chosen the easy path. "Now get the hell away from my store," Martinez finished, "before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." I looked around at the faces surrounding me. 20, maybe 30 people, all united in their judgment of me. All certain they understood my story better than I did. All confident that they would never, could never, end up where I was standing. The businessman in the expensive suit checking his Rolex. The college girl with her designer coffee and her daddy's credit card. The construction worker heading to a job that paid him enough to rent a room somewhere. The retiree walking her little dog, both of them looking at me like I might be contagious. Every single one of them convinced that the difference between their life and mine was simply a matter of better choices. "Did you hear me?" Martinez demanded. "I said move." I nodded and started walking toward the street. The crowd began to disperse, the show over, their entertainment value extracted from my misery. Time to get back to their own lives, their own problems, their own struggles that somehow seemed more legitimate than mine. But as I reached the sidewalk, I heard Martinez call out one last time, "And don't come back. Next time I see your sorry ass around here, I'm calling animal control." The laughter that followed me down the street was like acid in my ears. I walked for 6 blocks before I stopped, ducking into an alley between 2 apartment buildings. My hands were shaking, from cold, from humiliation, from rage I had no right to feel. I set my backpack down and pulled out the photograph, checking to make sure the water hadn't seeped through the plastic. It was safe, crinkled at the edges, faded from age, but safe. The picture had been taken 23 years ago at the grand opening of the first Martinez electronics store. My father, Alejandro Vasquez, stood behind a red ribbon with oversized scissors, smiling the proud smile of a man who'd built something from nothing. He was wearing his best suit, the navy blue one he saved for special occasions, and his hair was slicked back the way he always wore it for business meetings. Next to him, shaking his hand and grinning like he'd won the lottery, was a young man I barely recognized. Clean-shaven, skinny, wearing a cheap suit that was probably the nicest thing he owned. Roberto Martinez, 25 years old and hungry for success. And there, standing beside my father with a miniature pair of scissors in my small hands, was 7-year-old Diego Vasquez. Gap-toothed smile, cowlick that no amount of hair gel could tame, eyes bright with the excitement of being included in grown-up business. I remembered that day. Dad had let me help cut the ribbon while the photographer from the local paper snapped pictures. He'd told me I was witnessing history, the birth of what would become a small empire of electronics stores across 3 counties. "This young man," Dad had said, clapping Roberto on the shoulder, "reminds me of myself at his age, ambitious, hard-working, willing to do whatever it takes to succeed. I'm proud to be his partner in this venture." Roberto had been Dad's protege back then, a kid from the wrong side of town who'd worked his way through community college, impressed my father with his knowledge of electronics and his hunger to prove himself. Dad had fronted him the money to open his first store, taught him everything about the business, treated him like the son he was proud of. While I, the actual son, was busy destroying everything Dad had tried to build. The drinking started in high school, just weekends at first, then weekends and Wednesday nights, then pretty much every night that ended in Y. By college, I was majoring in beer pong and minoring in blackouts. Dad tried interventions, threats, bribes, tears. Nothing worked. The gambling came later, in my 20s, when the alcohol wasn't enough to fill the hole where my self-respect used to be. Poker at first, then sports betting, then anything that offered the possibility of turning $1 into $100, into $1,000, into enough money to make all the other problems disappear. I lost Dad's house in a poker game when I was 26, actually forged his signature on a loan document and put the house up as collateral for a stake in what I was sure would be the game that changed everything. The house he'd worked 30 years to pay off. The house where Mum had died. The house where he'd planned to spend his retirement. Gone in one night on a pair of jacks I was sure would hold up. That was the last time Dad and I spoke. Not because he threw me out. He would have forgiven me eventually, the way he'd forgiven everything else. But because I couldn't face him, couldn't look him in the eye and see the disappointment, the exhaustion, the slow death of his hope that I might still turn into the man he'd raised me to be. So I left, disappeared into the anonymous mass of people who live in the margins, who exist in the spaces between other people's lives. 3 years of shelters and park benches and charity meals, and the slow erosion of everything that had once made me Diego Vasquez, beloved son, heir to a business empire, someone who mattered. 3 years that led to this alley, this photograph, this moment of reckoning with the man I used to be and the man I'd become. I looked at Roberto's young face in the picture, so full of hope and determination. He'd built Dad's investment into something impressive. 7 stores now, from what I'd heard on the street. Martinez Electronics had become exactly what Dad had envisioned when he'd taken that hungry kid under his wing. But success had changed. Roberto, the grateful young man who'd once called my father Mr. Vasquez with genuine respect, had become the kind of person who threw mop water on homeless men for sport. The kid who'd worked 16-hour days to prove he deserved Dad's faith had become someone who thought poverty was a character flaw and homelessness was entertainment. I wondered if Dad knew, if he'd seen what his protege had become, or if Roberto still played the role of the grateful, hard-working success story when they talked. I wondered if Dad ever thought about me. I folded the photograph carefully and put it back in its plastic, wrapping, then buried it deep in my backpack where it would be safe. Then I sat down on the dirty concrete and put my head in my hands. The smart thing would be to find another doorway, another place to sleep, another street corner where I could hold out my cup and collect enough change to eat for another day. The smart thing would be to accept that this was my life now, that the man in the photograph was as dead as my mother, that some falls are too far to climb back from. But something was burning in my chest, hot and bright and unfamiliar. Something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Anger. Not the dull, constant ache of self-pity I'd carried for 3 years. Not the bitter resentment at a world that had forgotten I existed. This was something sharper, cleaner, more focused. Anger at Roberto Martinez for treating me like garbage. Anger at the crowd for enjoying the show. Anger at myself for taking it, for accepting it, for believing I deserved it. But mostly, and this, was the part that surprised me. Anger at the waste of it all. At the man I used to be, the life I used to have, the future I'd thrown away one drink, one bet, one stupid decision at a time. I pulled out my phone, an ancient flip phone I'd found, in a dumpster, held together with electrical tape but still functional enough to make calls. I'd been carrying it for months without using it, telling myself I was keeping it for emergencies while knowing the truth. I was keeping it because I was too scared to make the one call that mattered. The number was still programmed in, still listed under Dad. My finger hovered over the call button. What would I say? How do you apologize for 3 years of silence? How do you explain that you disappeared, not because you didn't love someone, but because you loved them too much to let them watch you destroy yourself? How do you ask for help when you've proven repeatedly and spectacularly that you can't be helped? I flipped the phone closed and put it back in my pocket. Not today. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Wasn't ready to hear the hope in his voice, or worse, the resignation. But I was ready for something. I stood up and walked back toward 5th Street, toward Martinez Electronics, toward the scene of my humiliation. Not to confront Roberto. I wasn't stupid enough to think that would end well. But to see it again. To look at the store, at the man, at the life that had somehow grown from the seeds my father had planted. The crowd was gone now, the morning, rush hour in full swing. Roberto was inside, visible through the glass windows, helping a customer pick out a new phone. He was smiling, charming, the picture of a successful small business owner who knew how to make people feel like valued customers. Watched him work, remembering the techniques Dad had taught him, how to listen to what the customer really needed, not just what they thought they wanted, how to build trust through expertise and genuine service, how to treat every person who walked through the door like they mattered. Everything Roberto had learned from watching my father, he was still using, just not with people like me. As I watched, a well-dressed woman walked in carrying a broken tablet. Roberto greeted her warmly, took the device, examined it carefully, and explained her options with patience and professionalism. When she decided to buy a replacement instead of repairing the old one, he helped her transfer her data, set up her new device, and sent her out the door with a smile and a business card. This was the Roberto Martinez my father had believed in. Hard-working, customer-focused, building his business one satisfied client at a time. But I'd seen the other Roberto too, the one who threw dirty mop water on human beings for the entertainment of strangers, the one who gave speeches about personal responsibility while standing over someone who'd lost everything. Which one was real? Were they both real? Could someone be genuinely good in one context and genuinely cruel in another? I thought about Dad, about the lessons he'd tried to teach me about business and life. Character, he used to say, is how you treat people who can't do anything for you. He'd said it so often it had become family gospel, right up there with work hard and keep your word, and family comes first. By that standard, Roberto Martinez had failed the character test, spectacularly. But then again, so had I. For 3 years, I'd been taking handouts from people who owed me nothing, accepting charity from strangers, living off the kindness of others while contributing nothing in return. What did that say about my character? The difference, I told myself, was that I'd never pretended to be something I wasn't. I'd never stood over someone and lectured them about responsibility while they were at their lowest point. I'd never turned someone else's misery into entertainment, but maybe that was just another form of self-deception. Maybe we all tell ourselves stories to make our failures easier to live with. I watched Roberto help another customer, then another. The morning rush was keeping him busy, and he moved through the store with the confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world. Someone who'd taken an opportunity and made something meaningful out of it. The opportunity my father had given him. The opportunity that should have been mine. I turned away from the store and started walking again. No destination in mind, just movement for the sake of movement. The sun was getting higher, and the streets were filling up with people who had places to be and purposes to serve. I walked past the library where I sometimes spent afternoons when it was too cold to stay outside, past the church that served free meals on Wednesdays and Sundays, past the shelter where you could get a bed for the night if you showed up early enough, and past the sobriety test. The geography of survival that had become my entire world. But today, for the first time in 3 years, it felt small, temporary, like something I was passing through rather than something that defined me. I found myself heading toward Riverside, toward the neighborhood where I grew up. It was a long walk, 8 miles at least, but I had nothing but time and nowhere else to be. The houses got nicer as I walked, the lawns greener, the cars newer. I passed the elementary school where I'd learned to read, the park where Dad taught me to throw a baseball, the corner store where Mom used to send me to buy milk and bread. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do, but also sadder somehow, like the neighborhood had aged along with everyone who lived there. I turned onto Maple Street and there it was, 1247 Maple Street, the house where I'd grown up. White siding, blue shutters, small front porch, with the swing Dad had built himself. The rose bushes Mum had planted were still there, bigger now, sprawling across the front of the house in a riot of red blooms. There was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize, a sensible sedan, maybe 5 years old, well maintained, but nothing fancy. The kind of car a man in his 70s would drive, practical and reliable. Dad's car. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, looking at the house like it was a museum exhibit. The life of Diego Vasquez before everything went wrong. The treehouse Dad and I built together was still visible in the old oak in the backyard, weathered and sagging, but somehow still hanging on. Like everything else from the life I used to have. I wondered what Dad was doing in there. Reading the morning paper with his coffee probably, the way he always had. Maybe paying bills at the kitchen table, or working in his home office, managing whatever remained of his business empire after I'd cost him the house, and God knows what else. I wondered if he ever looked out the window and thought about me. If he worried, or if he'd finally given up and moved on. I wondered if he'd forgiven me. Most of all, I wondered if I'd ever have the courage to find out. A car turned onto the street, moving slowly, and I realized I'd been standing there for almost an hour, staring at the house like some kind of stalker. The last thing I needed was for someone to call the police about a suspicious homeless man casing the neighborhood. I started walking back toward downtown, back toward the world where people like me belonged. But something had changed during those 8 miles of walking, during that hour of staring at the life I'd thrown away. The burning in my chest was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt almost like hope. If hope could be sharp-edged and desperate and tinged with the kind of determination that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. I thought about Roberto Martinez, about the way he'd looked at me like I was something less than human, about the crowd of people who'd watched my humiliation like it was dinner theater, about 3 years of being invisible, of being overlooked, of being dismissed as someone who didn't matter. I thought about my father, about the lessons he'd tried to teach me, about the man he'd raised me to be, before I'd decided being that man was too hard. And I thought about the photograph in my backpack, about the little boy with the gap-toothed smile who'd believed he was going to grow up to be someone important. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe rock bottom wasn't where you gave up. Maybe it was where you finally had nowhere to go but up. Maybe the man who'd thrown mop water on me this morning had no idea who he was really dealing with. Maybe it was time for Diego Vasquez to come, back from the dead. I pulled out my phone again, flipped it open, and stared at Dad's number for a long time. Then I closed it and put it back in my pocket. Not yet. Not until I had a plan. Not until I could offer him something more than apologies and promises I might not be able to keep. But soon. Very soon. The sun was high overhead now, beating down on the concrete and turning the air thick and sticky. I needed to find shade, find water, find a place to think and plan and figure out how to turn 3 years of failure into something that looked like redemption. I needed to disappear for a while. Not the way I'd disappeared 3 years ago, running from my problems and my responsibilities and myself. This time, I needed to disappear with purpose. This time, when I came back, I was going to be someone Roberto Martinez would remember, someone he'd wish he'd treated with respect when he had the chance, someone who proved that sometimes the people you step on are just waiting for the right moment to remind you that they know exactly where you sleep at night. I smiled for the first time in months and started planning my resurrection.